I'm your host, The Wolf's Den, and this is a podcast for those who like to pause and customize their party for JRPG games. And there are 3 parts to every show. There's what I've been reflecting on, what have I been grinding on, and what's the bard's tale for the week. And I'm excited for this week's episode. And consider this episode part one of what I hope to eventually make a longer discussion. I have been playing Tales of Berseria, as I highlighted in the last podcast. I'm having some not great thoughts about the dungeon experience at the very beginning of the game. But it got me thinking, what am I even thinking for dungeons anyway to be good in an RPG? Like, what does that mean? Or what are the types? Or what are the characteristics? And so what I wanted to share with you are what I consider the 4 main dungeons in JRPGs, which you kind of get. You get the streamlined dungeon, the gimmick dungeon, the test of endurance dungeon, and then a real puzzle dungeon. I think those are your 4 broad classifications, where a streamlined dungeon is just as it says. It is really a path A to B experience, where a gimmick dungeon, which is like we have one core concept and we're going to milk it for what it's worth, have fun. A test of endurance is supposed to be this long, arduous experience where this is really getting at your resource management or your ability to make sure you conserve HP or mana HP, things of that nature. And then lastly, a puzzle dungeon is really expecting you to sit and wait and play around. Like, the rooms are built for you to be like, okay, let me come in and out, let me try this. And like, you're supposed to spend some time just examining and making sense of what's happening. So, my very first question is, do you agree that those are the 4 styles of dungeons? I'm going to break down each of them, but I really think that that's where this comes down to, that when you get to the brass tacks of it, those are the 4. The only other dungeon type I thought about, but I just couldn't think of really good enough examples, are kind of the story set piece dungeons, where they're just designed to evoke a story moment. And I just can't think of enough that's like that. There are dungeons that have pivotal story moments, but I still think that the dungeon design isn't just to elicit that. At least off the top of my head, I couldn't think of any. And so let me go through these types with you. And we're going to walk our way through and see if we agree or disagree. So what do I consider a streamlined dungeon? Which means that this is a classic dungeon, which means that, yes, it has on and off paths with treasures at one point, and you want to take the long way around. Like, all the things that RPG fans kind of have learned to do. But there really isn't anything else here. It really is designed to be beginning to end experience. And what they try to do is, again, going to what I highlighted before, is like they're trying to inject some story, or they try to inject some kind of theme to make it a more richer experience than the core design is. They don't really want you to get lost. They want you to really be invested in the core story or the core journey. And what are some of the examples that come to mind? I'm thinking Lab 32 from Chrono Trigger. And I've used Lab 32 because, yes, it's a really small designed experience. It isn't like this elaborate dungeon. And note, I'll be using dungeon for like closed off paths, even though they're not all like literal dungeons. Where the core thing is to make sure you have that travel experience in the future, / you have that wonderful gimmick ride race with the guy. Like, it's a straightforward thing, and I would argue that for Chrono Trigger specifically, most of the dungeons are of that ilk. They're very straightforward, and it's just trying to give you a nice, quick pace. Another example of a nice, streamlined dungeon. Again, this isn't inherently a wrong thing or a bad feature. I'm thinking Ipsen Castle in Dragon Quest V. Notice I'm using a lot of early dungeons, because I do think games try to onboard you through more streamlined experiences just to kind of get you grounded, where the core premise of sneaking into a haunted house as a kid is such the biggest draw. I mean, you do engage with spirits, you do engage with all these other things, and it is really to engage with you as like being scared as a child and that element and so forth. Great dungeon, but it's nothing in its pathways is mind-blowing. It's a beautiful place to be, and a nice, thoughtful experience. but it is designed to keep you going forward. That is what I consider a streamlined dungeon. So what do I consider a gimmick dungeon? What is that there is a core concept and they just want to take it all the way to the extreme. A perfect example is, sorry, I said that I called the Dragon Quest place Ipsen, where it's supposed to be upstating. Ipsen, Final Fantasy 9. So when I think of a gimmick dungeon, best example is Ipsen Castle, where all the strong pieces of equipment do not work, and you have to equip the weak pieces of equipment, and there's a whole new battle formula around that concept that you can buy the new weapons from the Moogle. And that really is the core gimmick, and they give you certain monsters that you have to like defeat in certain ways to really maximize this process. Straightforward gimmick, and the entire thing is built for you to plan and make decisions around that. Another great example are the monkey caves. I hate this. I hate this. I hate this. If I could zoom in right now, tell you I hate the monkey caves. But the core idea is that the monkey caves is that every monkey, you're trying to give them something else. All the rooms look very similar. All the monkeys look very similar. And you're trying to give one person to give one item, to give another, to give another item, to give another, to give another item, just to uncover paths. It's annoying. They're committed to the bit too much. It's one of the main reasons why I'll never give Earthbound a 10 out of 10. I just cannot do it. That dungeon is pain. But this is an example of a gimmick dungeon. Can't really argue. It is what it is. It is probably the only real gimmick dungeon in Earthbound. I don't think there's anything that commits to that level of a bit. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get to. Is like, dungeons have concepts and ideas, but if you have to like engage with the mechanic or concept so much throughout, it's a gimmick. Then they're what I call tests of endurance. These are dungeons that talk about, can you conserve your MP usage? Can you conserve your item usage? Can you maneuver around enemies carefully so you don't run out of HP? Long distances between HP save rooms. That is what I think of. Perfect example to me is Mount Moon. Mount Moon, I think, is probably one of the most iconic, and I'd argue that it's such an effective dungeon that I think for all the Victory Road designs for Pokemon are built off the back of Mount Moon. Mount Moon is, at least for when I played it as a child, is such a arduous, long beast of an experience. Yes, as you play it older, you don't see it that way, but it is a perfect example of they're really trying to train you. Do you have your escape rope? Do you have your potions? Do you have your poison heals? All of those things that are very much a part of early era Pokemon is a test of endurance. But that obviously is not the only way it needs to be done. You can do it in similar to what happens in something like SMT3, where these are places that have some type of traps, actually, or things that are designed to send you back to the beginning or get lost in the warp, where I would not call these puzzles per se or even gimmicks. They're just designed to make the journey very, very long. And that isn't inherently good or bad. It's just what it is. I guess a total side tangent, but I've been wanting to figure out where I fit in this conversation with JRPGs overall. For sometimes the critiques of JRPGs around issues of pacing and length, they're right in the sense of I like the concept of short games and I enjoy short games, and I do think games would be better by being shorter a lot of the time. But one of the things I think about that dungeons really add to is a sense of going on a journey. And I don't know how often you can shortcut that by hours and still feel like you grew with these people or you went through this experience with people. And when I think about the most important part to a JRPG, it's that I should feel like I'm traveling with a band of people. That's just something I've been thinking about. And so when I think of tests of endurance, this can build your affinity to your crew because you have went out of your way to take care of them, watch over them, and they come through in the clutch in certain times. I really do think we should place a lot of respect on tests of endurance. But I also admit that it's not my default dungeon style. I would argue that early eras of JRPGs, like the NES era, and an entire genre I don't have history with, the first-person dungeon crawlers are this is their bread and butter. And sometimes, because I know that this isn't my personal taste all the time, it makes me a little bit weary heading in that direction. But I want to see if I can enjoy it or appreciate it. And so that leaves the final dungeon type to me, which is a puzzle, which is that, yes, similar to gimmicks, you're dealing with a core reoccurring mechanic, but it isn't just showing up at every spot. It's about like seeing the dungeon in a different way or seeing the space in a different way. That is, to me, is the fundamental thing, where it's like you see the orientation, the design of the dungeon with different elements connecting to each other in different unique manners. That is the ideal puzzle. Not every puzzle dungeon has that, but when I think about it, it's so much about environment. When I go back to gimmick examples, gimmicks are not about environment necessarily. They can be, but it's not I don't change my perspective of Ipsen Castle. I don't change my perspective of Monkey Cave as I continue to do it. My understanding of something like Jupiter Lighthouse from Golden Sun or Ayers Rock or even some of the Cloister Trials, those are examples of, oh, this is reshifting my perspective, or I have to play with my perspective or play with what I see. Yeah. And so I've been thinking that these are the 4 core types. And I can hear a couple of listeners in the background. So what does that mean for something like Persona 5? The funny thing is I think Persona 5 falls in a couple of these spaces. I have used the phrase test of endurance with Persona 5 before, and I would argue that that is a major element. And compared to a lot of these dungeons, the idea in Persona 5 is that you should not, quote unquote, finish it in one session. Obviously, for long dungeons in other games, you don't necessarily finish in one session. What I mean that is like multiple play sessions, like 3 or 4 or 5 for like Persona 5, particularly around SP conversion and limited. And you can argue that stuff like the Okumura dungeon is just a bunch of traps to kind of get you annoyed and like be more of a test to heighten the test of endurance. You could argue it's a puzzle as well. I just don't think the puzzles are that deep or interesting. But you could argue that it does get you to think about it in a slightly different way. But I do think the puzzles are not as fleshed out environment-wise for me to say that. And maybe I'm tripping, maybe I'm not really thinking, but I'm thinking very much back to the early puzzles around the bank. The bank, you're doing a lot of code, you're doing a lot of this code opens this thing. You're not necessarily seeing that in a new way. I think your best bet, if you're going to sell me on Persona 5 dungeons being full puzzle designs, is going to be the desert dungeon. I think that's the best the puzzles get in that game. And I'm open to that, right? Because I also think the puzzle added to the story as well. Like, you're really putting all so many pieces together. It's a reason why that's possibly the best dungeon in the game. But I don't know. You guys tell me. Of these 5, it's definitely not streamlined. It's at least a gimmick, a test of endurance, or a puzzle. Maybe it's just all 3. But I know that my Persona 5 audience wanted to know. And so I say that to lead into my Tales of Berseria playthrough. And I'm not impressed in how they open on this. We have been... Let me pull up my little list. We have been, thus far, again, I haven't played it very much. I've been in about 4 different places. The Prison of Titania, the First Real Cave, the Wilderness Path, and the Secret Gate area. And I'm going to just be honest with you. This is some whackness. I do not... Look, I like Tales of Berseria, and I think that they designed their dungeons well. I was expecting, give or take, similar levels. And you know what it is? Is that they're playing in my face. It's not even so much that the paths or anything in Tales of Berseria is bad, is that they just weren't playing in my face. The Sorcerer's Ring and using the Sorcerer's Ring to move things around is good enough. Even you have the push block stuff that's like very straightforward. They weren't playing in my face too much. Tales of Berseria is playing in my face like I'm an idiot. And that is weird. Because I've never dealt with dungeon blockades where all you do is press X to get through them. And I was like, okay, the first time it happens in the very first cave where you deal with Doyle. Yeah, okay. The Wilderness Path, They teach you an entirely new mechanic. You're like, oh, this is going to be cool. What does it allow me to do? It just goes forward. And then the same thing, the secret gates. I'm like, what are we even doing? And so what you might be talking about, okay, express what you mean. So far, in Tales of Berseria, there are 2 mechanics I've learned to proceed in dungeons. 3, really. 1, press X to break a rock. 2, press X to burn I guess, vines. And then 3, press X to jump on rocks to cross something. The thing that drives me crazy is that all 3 of them are just linear paths with a blockade that's just asking you to tap a button and go forward. You don't get any kind of new path. You don't get any new kind of real interaction. It really is, hey, you're still going straight. We just wanted to stop you. That is not design. That I don't get it. It's baffling to me that it's entirely baffling that this was their design approach. And look, if those things come around and evolve to be more sophisticated later, I welcome it. But what I'm seeing is these things being my primary blockades and not changing my interaction in the dungeon. And all they're leaving behind are paths with like small gaps in between. So yes, I know I'm going to come back to some of these places and see them in some new lights, but it doesn't feel like the mechanical enhancement is going to be there. And so in my mind, I'm like, if you're stopping me from just going forward, just let me go forward. There's no press X to continue to go forward is not an interesting experience. And I think it drove me crazy the most in that wilderness path, where it was really baiting me with a new idea, and the idea was the same as the previous place. It also doesn't help that part of what I'm noticing with Tales of Berseria is that the dungeons aren't entirely interconnected. Not that they're not, but you have to go through loading screens to get to some place. No, these loading screens are tiny and small, but it makes me not feel like exploring. I mean, I've realized every time I want to, like, oh, let me, as I've learned in every other JRPG, go off the beaten path, go find something. They are blockading something with just like a gap or whatever. And you're just like, I get it for the first dungeon. I get it for the second dungeon. But like third and fourth paths, like I'm not getting anything out of this experience from that. And so I'm a little bit disappointed. Because again, I would never say the Sorcerer's Ring is this deep, complex thing, but I think they had a really good idea. And maybe this game might bring back something like the Sorcerer's Ring, but it perturbed me. But I don't want to say that the entire experience has been bad. In fact, I'd argue Velvet continues to shine all the way through, and I love it. Velvet is wonderful. There's a moment, so we find Velvet, quote unquote, stealing number 2, who's a Malachim. Essentially, Malachims are peoples who obey exorcists through a oath. And we see her being able to alter the Malachim's obedience and take the Malachim. And so a couple of things are arising. One, we think, or at least is alluded, that the Malachim looks like Laphicet, her dead brother. And not too long after you recruit number 2, she names him Laphicet. There's some visual imagery similar. Laphicet like compasses. Number 2 seems to like compasses. They're building that parallel and this idea of rebirth, and feels like they're setting the seeds. And I just think we're just getting some good Velvet moments because of the presence of, I'm going to just call him Laffy 2. I think about where literally to change allegiances, Velvet said, attack them or I'll eat you, because her hand can like consume the souls of Malachims and daemons. It worked. Hilarious. I also think very much of the shut up scene. So there's a moment where she tells number 2 to shut up. And when they interact with an enemy that could hurt them, and it took number 2, Laffy 2, to finally say something. And she's like, why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you tell me this? And he's like, but you told me to shut up. And you could tell just like she recoiled. And she's like, wow, what did I say to this young person? Like, there's a shock to that. There's a time later where that kind of gets enhanced because getting attacked by a tiger, or was it a tiger or some other beast, and basically reinforces the idea is like, if you're not careful, Laphicet has no humanity, just obedience. And so she now has to think about like the terseness that she's been developing by becoming a beast. Like she now has to, she feels guilt for how she's interacting, and now she has to re-engage her humanity to help Laphicet gain humanity. It's really, it's a basic setup, but it's effective, and I think it just gives her dimensions that prevent her from just being the full revenge-driven person. I'm thinking a lot about, you get interactions like with her with Maggie Lou, where the whole thing was that she asked like, Maggie Lou, what did you tell the exorcist about me? And she's like, I started the story of Margaret Louis Fury Part 2. And then her response is, I'm starting to see why they wanted to execute you. Like, it is a deadpan, serious, break it down, like, no nonsense. But it just never feels harsh, right? Like, there's something there. And I think now that Laffy 2 is back in the space, it allows Velvet to start to reflect on who she's becoming and what she's saying. You even get something where you do in this dungeon, Laffy 2 finds a book, and she's like, hold on to the book and hold on to the compass, and the book falls on him and he gets hurt, and she tells him to appreciate the pain because the pain means that you're alive. And he later reiterates that back to Rokoru and Aizen. And they're like, that's a little weird, but okay. And you can begin to see that the need for both of them to learn to live again, or again for Velvet, we don't know what the story for Laffy 2 is going to be. I still am going to go with my hunch. Live again is playing out. And I love it. I'm not going to lie to you. They're doing such a good job with her, but I'm gonna be honest with you, I am not impressed by any of the supporting cast. Like, we introduced Aizen. Aizen is a Reaper who has this terrible string of bad luck, and they're trying to like make that work, and I couldn't give a hootenanny. And I just don't think, as much as I've grown to like, I think it's Rokoru, he is cool. I'm interested in his past, the history of his sword. And he's good enough to play off of Velvet, but there's something missing from him. And so I've noticed I'm kind of tuning out the story a lot of the time. Like, Laffy 2 is doing a whole lot to like re-engage me. And it's not that they don't do interesting things. Like, I mentioned Doyle very lightly. How they set up Doyle and building off of Doyle to get him to do a part of the distraction, and this idea of continually switching allegiances throughout. Even Aizen, like, they're going to join their allegiance, but it's like everyone is kind of an anti-hero, and your allegiances are happening, but it's not trusted bonds. It's begrudging company. And again, I think all of that speaks to some really careful thought in the writing, but it's missing something, man. I get a little bit bored, and I'm disappointed in that. But we will see how it continues to go. And that's what I've been grinding on. And so what does that mean for the final thing? The Bard's Tale of the Week. We are going to Romancing Saga 2. Shoutouts to that remake looking amazing. So I've never played a Romancing Saga. We will eventually be talking to someone who's an expert in that and will be able to break it down for me. That remake looks gorgeous. Just looks great. And so I went back to the original soundtrack. Shoutouts to Kenji Ito. he has this beautiful theme called Victor's Unexpected Demise. Now, the little bit I know about Romancing Saga is that your heroes can die, and it's like a family legacy oriented thing. So I don't know if it's referring to that or if there's like a major story moment where a major character dies. Don't know. But the tragedy evoked in these organs? Oh. And then around like 22 seconds, there's like this additional piano. And then buried under this a little bit brighter piano is this very dark piano. So you have this organ, 2 layers of pianos, and then later you get these horns, and there's just deep solemnness. But as the horns continue to go, there's this kind of encouraging fresh start vibes. It's sad, it's somber, but it's not dour. It's peaceful. And all I could think of was that this feels like a cross between a Dragon Quest song and a Fire Emblem song in the best ways possible. And so, if you've never listened to Victor's Unexpected Demise or Victor's Unexpected Demise, go listen to what Kenji Ito did. He was in his bag for that. If you can enjoy a good tragic story or within a song and the somberness in one, I highly recommend. And so that caps off this week. I am excited to continue talking with you soon. There will be more Tales of Berseria discussion next week. But in the meantime, keep changing the world. Continue to pause and customize your party. You can find me, The Wolves Den, at The Wolves Den 25 on Twitter and Instagram and Threads. You can find the podcast itself at Menu Combat on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. And then if you want to find me on TikTok, The Wolves Den 25. We here at Menu Combat, me specifically, are grateful that you guys are still listening. Grateful for your presence. It's been a hard season to record, if I'm honest with you. Had been some major moments, but I've wanted to continue to share my love and passion, and just hearing anybody's thoughts, anyone's listening to this, is something that brings me joy as I continue to try to find sources of that in this season. It brings me joy to know that there are some folks who are here listening to me ramble about JRPGs, because it's one of my favorite things. Much love. Keep changing the world. Peace.